In the waning days of the Roman Empire, Livia, a 25-year-old widow struggling to survive in the countryside outside Rome, faces an impossible choice, with her family's farm failing and creditors closing in. Their last valuable possession, a magnificent stallion named Tempest, represents their final hope. But when she witnesses a condemned gladiator, Marcus Aurelius, 30, being sold at auction to fight in the deadly games, her compassionate heart overrules her desperate need. This single act of sacrifice will set in motion a chain of events that will test the bounds of love, honor, and redemption in an empire built on blood and spectacle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard as Livia ran her trembling fingers through Tempest's jet-black mane. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, his powerful muscles rippling beneath her gentle touch. At 25, Livia had already buried a husband and watched her world crumble piece by piece, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. "Livia, we must go," her younger brother Gaius whispered from the doorway. At 19, he bore the weight of responsibility far beyond his years, his once bright eyes now dulled by months of watching their family's fortune slip away like sand through desperate fingers. She pressed her forehead against Tempest's warm neck, breathing in his familiar scent of hay and earth. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." The horse had been her late husband's pride and joy. Marcus, not the gladiator, but her beloved Marcus, who had died of fever 2 winters ago, had trained Tempest from a colt. The stallion was worth more than their small farm, more than everything else they owned combined. He was their last hope, their final chance to pay the mounting debts that threatened to destroy what remained of their family. "The auction starts at midday," Gaius said, his voice strained. "If we're late, we'll lose our chance to get a good price." Livia nodded, still unable to look away from the horse. Their elderly servant, Helena, appeared beside Gaius, her weathered face creased with concern. At 65, she had served their family since before Livia was born, and now she too faced an uncertain future. "Child," Helena said softly, "this isn't goodbye forever. Perhaps whoever buys him will what?" Livia's voice cracked. "Treat him kindly. Love him as we have." She finally turned, tears glistening in her dark eyes. "We both know he'll either end up as some senator's trophy, or worse, sold to the games to be torn apart by wild beasts." The weight of their situation pressed down on them like a physical force. The farm that had sustained their family for 3 generations was dying. The olive groves were diseased, the grain stores nearly empty, and the tax collectors grew more insistent with each passing day. Without the money from selling Tempest, they would lose everything within the month. Gaius placed a gentle hand on his sister's shoulder. "The gods have not been kind to us, but perhaps they will smile upon Tempest's new owner." "The gods," Livia said bitterly, "seem to have forgotten we exist." As they prepared to leave, Livia took one last look at their modest villa. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now seemed to whisper of endings. The garden where she had played as a child was overgrown with weeds. Even the small shrine to their household gods appeared abandoned, the offerings long since dried up. "Are you certain about this?" Helena asked, her voice heavy with unspoken understanding. "Once we take him to market, we have no choice," Livia replied, though her heart screamed otherwise. "Gaius deserves a future. You deserve security in your old age. I cannot let my sentiment destroy what's left of our family." The journey to Rome took most of the morning. As they approached the city's outskirts, the familiar sounds and smells assaulted their senses, the cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food, the constant din of construction as the empire continued its endless expansion. The horse market occupied a large square near the Circus Maximus. Wooden pens held animals of every description: war horses from Gaul, racing mares from Spain, oxen from Germania, and exotic creatures from the far reaches of the empire. The air buzzed with negotiations conducted in a dozen languages, the sharp voices of auctioneers and the nervous whinnying of frightened animals. Livia's heart sank as she saw the crowd gathered around the central auction block. Wealthy patricians in their finest togas stood alongside hard-faced merchants and gladiator trainers, all seeking their next purchase. She recognized several faces from previous visits to the city, men who viewed animals as mere commodities, investments to be bought, used and discarded. The auction for fine horses begins soon, a portly man in expensive silk announced. We have specimens from across the empire. As they led Tempest toward the registration area, Livia noticed another commotion near the slave auction block. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in excitement or disgust. It was difficult to tell which. Despite her focus on the task at hand, curiosity drew her closer. Gladiator, for sale, the auctioneer shouted. Fresh from the schools of Capua, this one has fought in the arena and lived to tell the tale. Livia's breath caught in her throat as she saw the man chained to the auction block. He was tall and powerfully built, probably around 30 years old, with the distinctive scars that marked him as an experienced fighter. His dark hair was cropped short in the Roman military style, and his deep-set eyes burned with a mixture of rage and resignation. Despite the chains, despite the jeers of the crowd, he held himself with unmistakable dignity. Marcus Aurelius, the auctioneer continued, trained in sword and shield, spear and net, 17 victories in the arena. A proven killer. The name struck Livia like a physical blow. Marcus Aurelius, the same name as her beloved husband, though this man bore no resemblance to her gentle farmer. This Marcus was all sharp angles and barely contained violence, a predator forced into captivity. What's his crime? Someone in the crowd shouted. Desertion from the legions, the auctioneer replied with theatrical flair. Caught fleeing his post during the Germanic campaigns, the alternative was crucifixion. He chose the arena instead. Livia found herself unable to look away. The gladiator's eyes swept the crowd with undisguised contempt, until they suddenly met hers. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply stared at each other across the dusty square. In his gaze, she saw something that the crowd had missed, not just anger and pride, but a deep, bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much, fought too long, and lost all hope of redemption. Starting bid 100 denarii, the auctioneer announced. The bidding began immediately. Gladiator trainers competed fiercely, recognizing the value of an experienced fighter. With each raised bid, Livia watched the light in Marcus Aurelius's eyes dim a little more. He knew, as she did, that whoever purchased him would work him until he died in the sand of some provincial arena. 500 denarii, called out a man Livia recognized as the owner of one of Rome's most notorious gladiator schools. His fighters rarely lived more than a year. 600, countered another trainer, this one known for staging elaborate beast hunts where condemned men were torn apart for the entertainment of the masses. As the price climbed higher, Livia felt a strange compulsion growing within her chest. She looked from the doomed gladiator to her own beloved Tempest, waiting patiently in his pen for his turn at auction. Both were magnificent creatures trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Both deserved better than the fate awaiting them. Livia Gaius whispered urgently, appearing at her side. What are you doing? The horse auction is about to begin. She didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced with a wild, impossible idea. The gladiator was being sold for around 600 denarii, almost exactly what they had hoped to get for Tempest. It was madness, complete and utter madness, but 700 denarii, the brutal trainer called out, his voice cutting through her thought. Without fully understanding why, Livia found herself pushing through the crowd toward the auction block. The gladiator's eyes found hers again, and this time she saw something else in their depths, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even hope. The auctioneer was raising his hand for the final call when Livia's voice rang out clear and strong across the square, 800 denarii. The crowd turned to stare at this unexpected bidder, a young woman in simple clothes, clearly not wealthy enough to afford such a sum. The Gladiator trainers scowled, sizing up their new competition. Livia Gaius grabbed her arm. "What are you doing? We don't have 800 denarii. "No," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "But we will." The realization of what she was contemplating hit her like a thunderbolt. To save this stranger, she would have to sacrifice everything. Not just Tempest, but their last hope of survival. It was the act of a madwoman, yet she couldn't bring herself to step back. "Do I hear 900? The auctioneer called out. The brutal trainer raised his hand, his face twisted with irritation. 900 to the gentleman in red, the auctioneer announced. Going once. Livia's world seemed to slow to a crawl. She looked at Marcus Aurelius one more time, saw the resignation settling back over his features like a funeral shroud. In moments, he would belong to a man who would use him up and discard him like a broken sword. Her hand moved of its own accord, rising into the air. 1,000 denarii. The square erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers. The gladiator's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd noticed him, his expression showed genuine surprise. "Livia, no," Gaius hissed. "We cannot." 1,000 denarii from the young lady. The auctioneer called out, clearly delighted by the unexpected turn. "Do I hear 1,100? The trainer in red studied Livia carefully, clearly trying to determine if she could actually pay such a sum. After a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back from the bidding. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer's hammer began to fall. "Sold, to the young lady for 1,000 denarii. As the crowd began to disperse, Livia stood frozen in place, the magnitude of what she had done finally sinking in. She had just committed to paying 1,000 denarii. She didn't possess to purchase a gladiator. She didn't need, all to save a man she had never spoken to. Marcus Aurelius was unchained and led toward her, his movements careful and controlled, despite the shackles around his ankles. When he reached her, he stopped and studied her face intently. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and rough, from years of shouting in the arena. Livia looked up at him. He was significantly taller than she had realized, and found she had no adequate answer. I don't know," she admitted. Before either could say more, the auctioneer's assistant approached with the bill of sale. 1,000 denarii payable immediately, he announced. Gaius stepped forward, his face pale. "Sir, we need to arrange payment. We have property to sell." As her brother began negotiating terms with the increasingly impatient official, Livia found herself alone with her impulsive purchase. Marcus Aurelius continued to study her with those intense dark eyes. "You have no money," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she replied simply. "Then you've bought yourself a considerable problem." Despite everything, Livia almost smiled. "It seems I have, madam," the assistant called out sharply. "We require immediate payment or the sale is void. The gladiator returns to auction." Livia's heart sank. She had acted on pure impulse, and now reality was reasserting itself with cruel efficiency. There was only one way to honor her bid, one sacrifice that could possibly cover the cost. "Wait here," she told Marcus Aurelius. Though she realized the absurdity of the instruction, where could a shackled gladiator go? She made her way through the crowd to where Tempest waited, still magnificent despite their morning of travel. Helena stood beside the stallion, her weathered hand stroking his neck. "Child," Helena said softly as Livia approached, "what have you done?" "Something foolish," Livia replied. "Something necessary. I'm not sure which." She looked into Tempest's intelligent eyes one last time, then turned to find the horse auctioneer. "Sir," she called out, "I wish to enter my stallion in the next auction." The auctioneer, a shrewd man who had been watching the drama unfold, nodded knowingly. "Emergency sale?" he asked. "Something like that." As Tempest was led to the auction block, Livia felt pieces of her heart breaking away like fragments of pottery. The horse auction proceeded with brutal efficiency. Bidding was fierce. Tempest was clearly a magnificent animal, and within minutes he was sold to a wealthy merchant for exactly 1,050 denarii. The extra 50 would barely cover the auction fees and expenses, but it was enough. With Tempest's bill of sale in hand, Livia returned to where Marcus Aurelius waited. The gladiator watched her approach, and she could see in his expression that he understood what she had done. "You sold your horse," he said. "Yes." "For me, yes." He was silent for a long moment. "I am a condemned man," he said finally. "A deserter, a killer. Why would you sacrifice so much for someone like me?" Livia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the scars and the chains to the man beneath. "Because," she said quietly, "everyone deserves a chance at redemption." As she handed over the payment and received Marcus Aurelius's ownership papers, Livia couldn't help but wonder what she had truly purchased. A gladiator was not a horse. He was a human being with his own will, his own desires, his own capacity for both violence and grace. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus Aurelius spoke again. "What happens now?" he asked. Livia looked around at the bustling market, at her worried brother, at Helena's concerned face, and finally back at the man whose life she had just bought, with everything she owned. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. And in that moment of complete uncertainty, their story truly began. The journey back to the farm passed in tense silence. Marcus Aurelius walked behind their small cart, his chains removed, but his freedom still an illusion. Livia had purchased him, yes, but what did that truly mean? Roman law was clear. He was her property now, no different from a tool or a piece of furniture. Yet as she stole glances at him during their slow progress along the dusty road, she found it impossible to think of him as anything other than a man who had made desperate choices in desperate times. Gaius drove the cart with white-knuckled hands, his jaw set in barely controlled anger. He hadn't spoken directly to his sister since leaving Rome, but his disapproval radiated from him like heat from a forge. Helena sat beside Livia, occasionally reaching over to pat her hand in a gesture of comfort that somehow made everything worse. "The neighbors will talk," Helena finally said as they crested the hill overlooking their valley. "A young widow, bringing home a gladiator." "Let them talk," Livia replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She knew Helena was right. In the small farming community where they lived, reputation was everything. A woman alone was already vulnerable to gossip and suspicion. A woman alone with a former gladiator would be fodder for scandal. Marcus Aurelius said nothing, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, evaluating. What must he think of this strange situation? What must he think of her? As they approached the villa, Livia's heart sank further. In the harsh light of late afternoon, their home looked even more shabby than she remembered. Paint peeled from the walls, tiles were missing from the roof, and the garden had surrendered almost entirely to weeds. What had once been a prosperous farm now bore all the marks of genteel poverty. "Home," Gaius said bitterly, as he brought the cart to a stop. For what it's worth, Marcus Aurelius stepped forward to help unload their few possessions from the market trip. But Gaius quickly moved to block him. "We don't need help from you," her brother said coldly. "Gaius," Livia protested, "no, sister, let's be clear about what's happened here. You've bankrupted us to save a stranger. The least he can do is understand his place." Marcus Aurelius studied the young man for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Your brother is right to be angry," he said to Livia. "You've made a fool's bargain." "Perhaps," Livia replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "But it's done now." As they entered the villa's main courtyard, the reality of their situation became even starker. What was she supposed to do with a gladiator? Where would he sleep? What would he... How could she possibly explain this to the servants who remained, to the neighbors, to the tax collectors who would soon return? "The slave quarters are behind the kitchen," Helena said quietly, reading her thoughts. "They're not much, but they're clean." "I'm not a slave," Marcus Aurelius said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Not anymore." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Technically, he was right. Gladiators occupied a strange position in Roman society, neither slave nor free. But Livia had purchased him, which complicated matters considerably. "What are you then?" Gaius asked challengingly. "A guest? A hired hand? What exactly is your status here?" Marcus Aurelius looked directly at Livia. "That's for your sister to decide." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was 25 years old, a widow trying to save her family's legacy, and now she was expected to navigate the complex legal and social implications of owning a human being who refused to be owned. "For now," she said carefully, "you're under our protection. We'll figure out the rest as we go." That evening, as Helena prepared a simple meal of bread, olives and watered wine, the tension in the household was palpable. They sat around the kitchen table, master and servant, brother and sister, and the gladiator who fit no easy category. The silence was broken only by the sound of eating and the distant lowing of their few remaining cattle. "Tell me about yourself," Livia said finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. Marcus Aurelius looked up from his meal. "What would you like to know? You were a soldier." "Yes, 10th Legion, stationed on the Germanic frontier. And you deserted." His jaw tightened. "Yes." "Why?" For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Have you ever seen a battlefield after the fighting is done, lady? Have you ever walked among the bodies of men who died for nothing more than a senator's ambition?" Gaius leaned forward. "All soldiers see death. It doesn't give them the right to abandon their duty." Marcus Aurelius turned those dark eyes on the younger man. "You're right, it does. But when you're ordered to burn a village full of women and children because they refuse to pay tribute to an emperor they've never seen, when you watch your commanding officer rape a girl younger than your own sister," he trailed off, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "Some duties aren't worth keeping." The raw pain in his voice silenced even Gaius. Livia found herself leaning forward, trying to understand this man she had impulsively saved. "What happened then?" she asked gently. "I walked away, made it almost to the coast before they caught me. The choice was crucifixion or the arena. I chose the arena." 17 victories, Helena said quietly. "That's what the auctioneer claimed." Marcus Aurelius nodded grimly. 17 men who died so Romans could be entertained with their blood. 17 fathers, sons, brothers, gone because the crowd wanted spectacle. "Yet you survived," Livia observed. "Surviving isn't living," he replied. "It's just continuing to breathe while everything inside you dies piece by piece." The honesty in his words struck her like a physical blow. She recognized the feeling he described, the slow erosion of hope, the daily struggle to find meaning in mere existence. She had felt it herself during the long months after her husband's death, watching their world crumble around her. "Why didn't you try to escape?" Gaius asked. Marcus Aurelius almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "From the ludus, impossible. They watch us constantly, train us to fight each other, not our captors, and even if you could get away, where would you go? I'm a marked man." Literally, he turned his arm to show a small brand burned into his flesh. "Property of the state, condemned to die for Rome's entertainment." "But you're not property anymore," Livia said impulsively. "You're free." "Am I?" He looked at her intently. "You paid 1,000 denarii for me. That makes me yours, doesn't it?" The question hung in the air like incense, and inescapable. What did she want from him? Why had she really made that impossible bid? "I don't want to own anyone," she said finally. I couldn't watch them sell you to that man, the one who bid against me. I knew what he would do to you. So instead, you've ruined your family to save a stranger." His voice was gentle now, almost kind. "That was incredibly foolish." "Yes," she admitted, "it was. And brave." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. There was something in his gaze, gratitude. Yes, but something deeper, recognition perhaps. the acknowledgement of one wounded soul seeing another. Gaius cleared his throat loudly, breaking the spell. Brave or foolish? It's done. The question now is what happens next. We have no money, no horse, and winter is coming. How do we survive? It was a fair question, and one Livia had no good answer for. The farm was failing, their creditors would return, and now they had an additional mouth to feed. She had acted on impulse and emotion, and now they would all pay the price. I can work, Marcus Aurelius said quietly. I may be a gladiator, but I was raised on a farm. I know animals, crops, repair work. I can earn my keep. Can you, Gaius asked skeptically, or will you disappear in the night once you've learned the layout of our land? The gladiator's expression hardened. I've never broken a promise I've made freely. Your sister saved my life. I won't repay that kindness with betrayal. Pretty words, Gaius replied. But you're still a deserter, a man who breaks oaths. Gaius, Livia snapped. That's enough. No, sister, it's not enough. Do you understand what you've done? We're harboring a condemned criminal. If the authorities discover him here, we'll all be arrested. Our family name will be destroyed. Marcus Aurelius stood slowly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. He's right, he said to Livia. My presence here puts you all in danger. Perhaps it would be better if I left. No, the word escaped Livia's lips before she could stop it. I mean, where would you go? You said yourself you're a marked man. There are places, remote areas where a man can disappear. It wouldn't be much of a life, but it would be a life. She found herself standing as well, panic fluttering in her chest. You can't leave. Not now. I didn't sacrifice everything just to watch you walk away. Then what do you want from me? The question was spoken softly, but it carried the weight of genuine need. Tell me what you want, and I'll try to give it to you. The honesty in his request took her breath away. What did she want from him? She barely knew herself. All she knew was that watching him walk toward that auction block had stirred something inside her that she thought had died with her husband. Compassion, yes, but more than that. Hope, perhaps. The belief that sometimes, against all odds, good could triumph over evil. I want you to stay, she said simply. I want you to help us save this farm. I want you to have a chance to be more than just a gladiator or a deserter. And if I can't, if I'm not the man you think I am, then at least you'll have had the chance to try. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll stay. For now. As the evening wore on and they made arrangements for his accommodation, the small room behind the kitchen would suffice. Helena declared. Livia found herself watching Marcus Aurelius with growing curiosity. He moved with the fluid grace of a trained fighter, but there was gentleness in the way he helped clear the table, consideration in how he stepped aside when Helena needed to pass. Later, as she lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she wondered what she had truly set in motion. Outside her window, she could hear the soft sounds of the night crickets chirping, a distant owl calling, the settling noises of their old house. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, Marcus Aurelius was probably lying awake as well, wondering about his strange new circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The neighbors would notice their unusual guest soon enough, and questions would follow. The creditors would still come calling, the farm would still need saving. But for tonight, she had done something her heart demanded. Consequences be damned. A sleep finally began to claim her. Livia's last conscious thought was of the moment when Marcus Aurelius had looked at her, across that crowded auction square. In his eyes, she had seen not just desperation, but dignity, not just anger, but honor. Perhaps Gaius was right, perhaps she had made a fool's bargain, but perhaps, just perhaps, she had also made the first step towards salvation. For both of them. Meanwhile, in the small room behind the kitchen, Marcus Aurelius sat on the edge of a simple bed, staring out at the star-filled sky. The accommodations were humble, but clean, better than the gladiator barracks he had called home for the past 2 years. More importantly, the door was not locked. He could leave whenever he chose. The woman Livia had saved his life for no reason he could understand. In the arena, every action had a purpose, every move calculated for survival. But her gesture had been pure impulse, driven by compassion rather than strategy. It was a type of courage he had almost forgotten existed. He thought of her standing in that crowd, raising her hand to bid against men twice her size and 10 times her wealth. She had looked terrified and determined in equal measure, a woman making an impossible choice for reasons that defied logic. Tomorrow, he would begin to repay her kindness. He would work her land, help restore what time and misfortune had damaged. It was the least he could do. But even as he made these plans, a part of him wondered if he was capable of the peaceful life she seemed to envision for him. His hands bore the calluses of a sword hilt. His body carried scars from dozens of fights. His dreams were haunted by the faces of men he had killed. Could such a man truly find redemption in the quiet rhythms of farm life? As he finally lay down to sleep, Marcus Aurelius found himself hoping that Livia's faith in him was not misplaced. She had given him something he thought lost forever, a chance to be more than the sum of his mistakes. He would try not to waste it. Dawn broke grey and cold over the struggling farm, and with it came the first real test of their new arrangement. Livia woke to the sound of voices in the courtyard, angry voices that made her stomach clench with dread. She dressed quickly and hurried outside to find 3 of their neighbors standing near the well, their faces grim with suspicion. Marcus Aurelius stood a few paces away, his posture alert but non-threatening. Even so, Livia could see the way the men's hands hovered near the knives at their belts. News traveled fast in farming communities, and clearly word of her unusual purchase had already spread. "Livia," called out Quintus Fabius, the eldest of the 3 and owner of the largest farm in the valley, "we need to talk." Gaius emerged from the house, his jaw set in that stubborn line she knew so well. Helena appeared beside him, wringing her hands nervously. The confrontation Livia had dreaded was beginning. "Good morning, Quintus," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What brings you here so early?" "You know why we're here," Quintus gestured toward Marcus Aurelius. "Word is you brought home a gladiator yesterday, a condemned man. His status is his own business," Livia replied carefully. "Like hell it is," snapped Lucius Varro, a red-faced man, whose farm bordered theirs to the south. "We have families, Livia. Children. We won't have a killer living among us." Marcus Aurelius stepped forward slightly, and Livia saw all 3 men tense. "I have no quarrel with any of you," he said quietly. "I seek only to work and live in peace." "Peace?" The 3rd man, Cassius Nerva, laughed harshly. "You're a gladiator. You've killed for sport. What do you know about peace?" "More than you might think," Marcus replied, but his voice carried an edge that made Livia's pulse quicken. Quintus raised his hand before the situation could escalate further. "Livia, be reasonable. We've known your family for decades. Your father was a good man. Your husband was well respected. Don't throw that legacy away for..." The dismissive way he said this while looking at Marcus Aurelius made Livia's temper flare. "Marcus is under my protection," she said firmly. "He's done nothing to harm anyone here." "Yet," Lucius added darkly, "what exactly are you suggesting?" Gaius asked, moving to stand beside his sister. Quintus's expression softened slightly. "We're suggesting that Livia reconsider this arrangement before it's too late. Sell him back to the gladiator schools, or better yet, turn him over to the authorities. Let them deal with him properly." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Livia had intended. "He stays. Then you're a fool," Cassius said bluntly. "And you're putting all of us at risk. What happens when the magistrates come looking for him? What happens when they discover we've been harboring a deserter?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Livia knew they were right to be concerned. The penalties for harboring fugitives were severe. But she also knew that sending Marcus Aurelius back to certain death was not an option she could live with. "If anyone comes looking," she said slowly, "they'll find a man who was legally purchased and freed. I have the papers to prove it." "Freed?" Quintus looked genuinely surprised. "You freed him?" The lie came so naturally that it frightened her. Of course, what did you think, that I would keep a slave? Marcus Aurelius turned to stare at her, his expression unreadable. They both knew she had done no such thing, but the fiction might provide them with legal protection if questions arose. Even so, Lucius pressed, a freed gladiator is still dangerous. Leopards don't change their spots. Perhaps not, Marcus said quietly, but men can change their hearts. If they're given the chance. Something in his tone made the three neighbors pause. There was dignity in his words, and a quiet strength that commanded respect despite their prejudices. Quintus studied him for a long moment. You claim to want peace. Prove it. Stay away from our families. Keep to this farm. Give us no reason to regret Livia's charitable impulse. You have my word, Marcus replied solemnly. After the neighbors left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the courtyard. Helena busied herself with morning chores, but Livia could see the worry lines etched deep in her weathered face. Gaius stood with his arms crossed, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions. You lied to them, Marcus said to Livia once they were alone. Yes. Why? She turned to face him fully. Because the truth would have gotten you killed. Because sometimes survival requires bending the rules, and if they discover the deception, then we'll face that problem when it comes. She paused, studying his face. Unless you'd prefer to leave, I won't hold you against your will. For a moment she thought he might actually go. His eyes swept the valley, taking in the rolling hills and distant forests, where a man could disappear forever. Then he looked back at her, and she saw his decision in the set of his shoulders. I gave you my word, he said simply. The next few days fell into a routine that surprised everyone with its normalcy. Marcus Aurelius proved true to his claim about understanding farm work. He repaired fences with the skill of someone who had grown up with tools in his hand. He tended their few remaining animals with gentle competence. Most surprisingly, he showed an intuitive understanding of the diseased olive groves that had been the source of their financial troubles. The trees aren't dead, he told Livia, as they walked among the gnarled trunks one morning. They're sick, but it can be treated. She looked at the brown, withered branches with skepticism. How do you know? My father's farm had the same problem when I was young. It's a fungus that spreads through the roots. If you cut away the infected wood and treat the soil with lime and ash, they'll recover. That would take months, Gaius pointed out. He had been shadowing them all morning, still suspicious of their unusual guest. The next harvest, yes, Marcus agreed, but the one after that could be substantial. These are old trees, they'll produce for decades if properly cared for. Hope flickered in Livia's chest. You really think we could save them? I think it's worth trying. That afternoon they began the painstaking work of pruning diseased wood from the olive trees. It was hard, dirty labor that left them all exhausted by evening, but for the first time in months, Livia felt like they were fighting back against their circumstances rather than merely enduring them. As they worked, she found herself stealing glances at Marcus Aurelius. Away from the arena, away from chains and crowds, he seemed like a different man entirely. He moved with purpose but without urgency, his hands gentle with the wounded tree. When he spoke to Gaius about proper pruning techniques, his voice carried the patience of a natural teacher. You're watching him, Helena observed quietly as they prepared the evening meal. I'm supervising, Livia protested weakly. Helena's knowing smile said more than words could. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing another simple meal, Gaius surprised everyone by addressing Marcus directly. Tell me about your father's farm, he said. Marcus looked up from his bread. What would you like to know? Was it like this one? Small, family-owned. Smaller, actually. We had maybe 20 olive trees, a small vineyard, some grain fields, nothing grand, but it fed us. His expression grew distant. My father used to say that the land would take care of us if we took care of it. What happened to it? Livia asked gently. Sold to pay taxes after my father died. My mother remarried and moved to the city. I joined the legions because, he shrugged, Because I thought I could make something of myself, see the world, serve Rome. Do you regret it? The question came from Gaius, and his tone was no longer hostile. Marcus considered this carefully. I regret the way it ended, but the boy who left that farm thought he knew everything about honor and duty. It took years of war to teach him how little he actually understood. And now I think my father was right. The land doesn't lie to you. It doesn't demand that you kill in the name of glory. It simply asks that you tend it with care. As the days passed, the tentative piece of their arrangement began to feel more solid. Marcus threw himself into the farm work with a dedication that impressed even Gaius. He rose before dawn to tend the animals, spent long hours in the olive groves, and worked on repairs until the light failed. More importantly, he showed no signs of the violence his former life might have suggested. He was patient with their aging oxen, gentle with the skittish goats, and consistently respectful in his interactions with Helena. When a fox got into their chicken coop one night, he tracked it down and relocated it to the far side of the valley, rather than killing it. Most men would have wrung its neck, Helena commented as she counted their surviving hens. Most men haven't seen enough killing to understand its weight, Marcus replied quietly. It was moments like these that made Livia question her initial assumptions about him. The man she had expected to be dangerous was proving to be remarkably peaceful. The killer she had feared might threaten their safety was showing more consideration for life than most free citizens. But it was during the evenings that she found herself most intrigued by Marcus Aurelius. Once the day's work was done and they gathered for their simple meal, he proved to be an engaging conversationalist. He had traveled throughout the empire during his military service and could describe the markets of Alexandria, the forests of Germania, and the sophistication of Greek cities with vivid detail. "You should have been a scholar," Livia told him one evening, after he had spent an hour describing the architectural marvels of Ephesus. "Perhaps in another life," he replied with a sad smile. "But soldiers' sons don't become scholars. We become soldiers or farmers or tradesmen. The paths are laid out for us before we're old enough to understand the choice." "That's not entirely true," Gaius interjected. "Look at Cicero. His father was nobody special, but he became one of Rome's greatest orators." "Cicero was also murdered for his principles," Marcus pointed out gently. "Sometimes the cost of rising above your station is higher than you expect to pay." These conversations revealed layers to Marcus Aurelius that Livia hadn't anticipated. Beneath the warrior's scarred exterior was a thoughtful, well-read man who spoke with insight about philosophy, politics, and human nature. He had clearly spent his years in the legions observing and learning, not just fighting. 2 weeks into his stay, their fragile peace was tested again. Livia was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching at speed. She looked up to see a small group of Roman soldiers riding toward their villa, their red cloaks bright against the grey sky. Her blood turned to ice. Had someone reported Marcus? Had the authorities finally come to reclaim their escaped gladiator? "Marcus," she called out, but he was already emerging from the olive grove, his face grim with recognition. "Patrol unit," he said quietly as he reached her side. "Probably just routine, but they might be looking for you." "Yes." Gaius and Helena appeared from the house, their faces pale with worry. The soldiers were close enough now that Livia could see their leader, a young centurion with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Stay calm," Marcus murmured. "Let me handle this." "No," Livia said firmly. "You're a freedman working on my farm. Nothing more." The soldiers drew to a halt in their courtyard, and the centurion dismounted with practiced efficiency. He was younger than Livia had expected, probably no more than 25, with the kind of clean-shaven good looks that suggested a privileged background. "Citizens," he said formally, "I am Centurion Lucius Maximus of the 4th Urban Cohort. We're conducting a routine survey of the area." "Welcome to our home, Centurion," Livia replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "How may we assist you?" The young officer's eyes swept their group, lingering for a moment on Marcus Aurelius. We're looking for information about any unusual activity in the region, strangers passing through, suspicious behavior, that sort of thing. I'm afraid we've seen nothing unusual, Livia said carefully. And you are? Livia Claudia, widow of Marcus Claudius. This is my brother Gaius, our servant Helena, and our hired man Marcus. The centurion's gaze sharpened as it focused on Marcus Aurelius. You look familiar, friend. Have we met? Marcus stepped forward slightly, his posture respectful, but not subservient. I don't believe so, sir. I've been working this farm for several weeks now. The centurion studied him intently. You have the bearing of a soldier. Ever serve in the legions? Livia's heart hammered against her ribs, but Marcus answered calmly. Briefly, sir. Auxiliary cohorts on the northern frontier. Nothing significant. It was masterfully done, enough truth to be believable, vague enough to avoid specifics. The centurion nodded slowly. Well, keep your eyes open, he said finally. There have been reports of bandits in the area. Deserters from the legions, probably dangerous men who might prey on isolated farms like this one. We'll be careful, centurion, Livia managed. As the soldiers prepared to leave, the young officer turned back to Marcus. One more time. You know, you really do look familiar. Are you certain we haven't crossed paths before? Quite certain, sir. The centurion mounted his horse and looked down at them all. Remember, if you see anything suspicious, report it immediately. The Empire has no tolerance for those who abandon their duties. After the soldiers disappeared over the hill, the four of them stood in silence for several long minutes. Finally, Helena released a shaky breath. That was too close, she whispered. He recognized you, Gaius said to Marcus. Didn't he? Marcus nodded grimly. Possibly. I don't remember him specifically, but I fought in front of thousands of people over the years. Any of them might recognize my face. What do we do? Livia asked. We continue as we have been, Marcus replied, and we hope that young centurion doesn't think too hard about where he might have seen me before. That night, as Livia lay in bed replaying the encounter, she realized how much her feelings about Marcus Aurelius had evolved. 3 weeks ago, she had impulsively bought a stranger to save him from a brutal fate. Now, the thought of losing him to the authorities filled her with genuine fear, not just for his safety, but for what his absence would mean to her own life. Somewhere along the way, Marcus had become more than just a rescued gladiator. He had become part of their small family, a man whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom had begun to fill spaces in her heart. She hadn't even realized were empty. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, as she drifted off to sleep, Livia found herself hoping that whatever the future held, Marcus Aurelius would be there to face it with them. In the small room behind the kitchen, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered how long their luck would hold. The centurion's suspicion had been clear, and it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection between the escaped gladiator and the helpful farm worker. But for the first time in years, he had something worth protecting. Not just his own life, but the fragile peace they had built together. The quiet satisfaction of honest work, the simple pleasure of shared meals, and most of all, the growing warmth in Livia's eyes when she looked at him. He had never expected to find redemption in such a humble place, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps true salvation could only be found in the quiet moments between one day's work and the next, in the trust of good people who saw past his scars to the man he was trying to become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight, for the first time since he had walked away from his post in Germania, Marcus Aurelius felt like he might actually have a future worth fighting for. The weeks that followed the soldier's visit passed in a blur of hard work and growing intimacy. The olive trees, under Marcus's careful tending, began to show signs of recovery. New green shoots emerged from the pruned branches, and the soil around their roots grew rich and dark from the lime and ash treatments. For the first time in months, Livia dared to hope that they might actually save the farm. But it wasn't just the land that was healing. She found herself watching Marcus with increasing fascination as he moved through his daily routines. There was something deeply attractive about a man who could handle an axe with deadly precision, yet use those same hands to gently coax a sick lamb back to health. When he worked shirtless in the olive groves, the sun highlighting the intricate pattern of scars across his back and shoulders, she had to force herself to look away. "You're staring again," Helena observed one morning as they prepared bread for the day's meal. "I'm not staring," Livia protested, though her cheeks flushed with heat. "Child, I may be old, but I'm not blind. The way you look at that man." Helena shook her head with a knowing smile. "Just be careful. Hearts that have been broken once heal stronger, but they also scar deeper when they break again." Livia wanted to deny the old woman's observations, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Somewhere between his first day on the farm and now, her feelings for Marcus Aurelius had evolved from gratitude to something far more complex and dangerous. It wasn't just his physical presence that drew her, though she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened when he was near. It was the quiet intelligence in his conversation, the unexpected gentleness in his treatment of wounded animals, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words truly mattered. After 2 years of widowhood, of making every decision alone and bearing every burden without support, having someone to share the weight with felt like a gift she had never dared to hope for. The crisis came on a morning when autumn was beginning to paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. Livia was hanging laundry to dry when she heard a commotion from the olive grove. Shouts, the sound of splintering wood, and underneath it all, a low growling that made her blood run cold. She dropped the wet tunic she was holding and ran toward the sounds, her heart pounding with terror. As she crested the small hill that overlooked the grove, she saw a scene that stopped her breath entirely. A massive wild boar, easily 3 times the size of their largest pig, had somehow gotten tangled in the irrigation channels Marcus had been repairing. In its panic to escape, the beast had become even more entangled, and now it faced Marcus with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The boar's tusks gleamed like ivory daggers, and foam flecked its muzzle as it prepared to charge. Marcus stood between the boar and the path back to the villa, a broken piece of fence post in his hands. It was a pathetically inadequate weapon against such a creature, but his stance was steady, his movements controlled. The gladiator's training was evident in every line of his body. "Easy," he said in a low, calm voice. "Easy now. No one wants to hurt you." The boar snorted and pawed the ground, clearly unconvinced by his peaceful intentions. Behind the beast, Livia could see that several of their young olive trees had been damaged in its thrashing. Precious growth that represented months of careful work. "Marcus," she called out, but he held up a hand without looking away from the boar. "Stay back," he said firmly. "This one's scared, not angry. Give me room to work." What happened next was like watching a master craftsman at work. Marcus began to move slowly, circling the boar with patient, deliberate steps. He spoke constantly in that same low, soothing voice, not to the animal but almost to himself, maintaining a steady rhythm that seemed to calm both predator and prey. The boar followed his movement, turning to keep him in sight, but the desperate edge of its fury began to fade. Marcus had somehow positioned himself so that the animal's escape route was clear. All it had to do was back away from the irrigation channel, and it could return to the forest. "That's it," Marcus murmured as the boar took a tentative step backward. "Nothing here worth fighting for. Go home to your family." For a long moment, the tableau held, man and beast, regarding each other with mutual respect and weariness. Then, as if reaching some internal decision, the boar grunted once and began backing away more quickly. Within moments, it had freed itself from the channels and disappeared into the undergrowth, with surprising grace for such a large creature. Marcus stood motionless for several heartbeats after the boar vanished, then slowly lowered his makeshift weapon. Only then did Livia realize she had been holding her breath. "Are you hurt?" she called out as she ran down the hill toward him. "I'm fine," he replied, but she could hear the adrenaline in his voice, just a little reminder that the countryside has its own danger. When she reached him, Livia found her hands shaking with delayed reaction. The sight of him facing down that massive creature with nothing but a broken piece of wood had terrified her in ways she hadn't expected. The thought of losing him, really losing him, had struck her like a physical blow. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice higher than usual. "But I wasn't." He turned to face her, and she could see the slight tremor in his own hands. "The gladiator schools teach you to read animals as well as men." That boar was frightened, not aggressive. It just needed a clear path to safety. Still, she looked at the damaged trees, the torn earth where the beast had thrashed. "We've lost weeks of work. Trees can be replanted," Marcus said quietly. "The important thing is that no one was hurt." As they walked back toward the villa, Gaius and Helena rushing to meet them with worried faces, Livia found herself stealing glances at Marcus. There had been something almost beautiful about the way he had handled the situation, not through violence, but through patience and understanding. Another man might have tried to kill the boar, risking injury and accomplishing nothing. Marcus had found a way to resolve the conflict without bloodshed. That evening, as they sat around their usual table sharing the day's bread and wine, the conversation inevitably turned to the morning's excitement. "I've never seen anything like it," Gaius admitted. "The way you handled that beast. It was like you were speaking its language." Marcus smiled slightly. "In the arena you learn that every creature fights differently when it's cornered versus when it's hunting. The boar was cornered, all it wanted was a way out. Most men would have tried to kill it," Helena observed. "Most men haven't killed enough to understand what a waste that would be." Marcus replied quietly. The words hung in the air, a reminder of the darkness in his past that he carried with such quiet dignity. Livia found herself reaching across the table without thinking, her fingers brushing against his hand in a gesture of comfort. The contact was brief, but the warmth that shot through her at the simple touch was anything but fleeting. Marcus's eyes met hers, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. In his gaze she saw surprise, gratitude, and something deeper, a recognition that mirrored her own growing feelings. "Livia," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Gaius cleared his throat loudly, breaking the spell. "Well," he said with forced cheerfulness, "I suppose we should be grateful it was just a boar and not bandits." The mention of bandits brought them all back to reality with jarring suddenness. The threat of discovery still hung over them like a sword waiting to fall. Despite the peace they had built together, despite the growing prosperity of the farm, they all knew that their happiness existed on borrowed time. Later that night, Livia found she couldn't sleep. The events of the day had stirred emotions she had tried to keep buried, and now they refused to be ignored. Finally, she gave up the pretense of rest and wrapped a cloak around her shoulders to walk in the garden. Night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. The familiar sense of earth and growing things surrounded her, but tonight they brought no peace. Her mind kept returning to the moment when Marcus's fingers had touched hers, to the look in his eyes, to the way her heart had hammered against her ribs. Couldn't sleep either. She turned to find Marcus standing at the edge of the garden, his own cloak thrown over his shoulder. In the moonlight he looked like a figure from legend, strong, mysterious, touched by shadows. "Too much excitement for one day," she said, trying to keep her voice light. He approached slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "I wanted to thank you," he said when he was close enough that they could speak in whispers. "Thank me for what?" "For not flinching. This morning when you saw me with the boar, many people would have seen only the gladiator, the killer. They would have assumed I was the dangerous one in that situation. But you weren't," Livia said simply. "You were the one trying to prevent violence, not cause it. How can you be so certain?" She studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the genuine uncertainty there. "Because I've been watching you for weeks now. I've seen how you are with the animals, with Helena, even with my brother, who hasn't exactly welcomed you with open arms. You're not the man they forced you to become in the arena. You're the man you chose to be when given the chance." His expression grew soft, almost vulnerable. "You see too much," he said quietly. "Or maybe you don't see enough." She took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Marcus, what do you see when you look at yourself?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying the stars above them. "I see a man who has made terrible choices, who has killed in the name of entertainment, who abandoned his duty and brought shame on his family's name." He looked back at her, and she could see the pain in his expressions. "I see someone who doesn't deserve the kindness you've shown him." "That's not what I see," she whispered. "What do you see?" The question was so quietly spoken she almost missed it. When she answered, her voice was equally soft. "I see a man who chose conscience over duty when duty demanded cruelty. I see someone who has suffered for his principles and emerged with his compassion intact. I see—" She paused, gathering courage for the truth. "I see someone I could love." The words hung between them like something fragile and precious. Marcus stared at her with an expression of wonder, as if she had just spoken in a language he had never heard before. "Livia," he breathed, and then his hands were framing her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Is this madness?" she whispered. "Probably," he replied, but he was leaning closer, and she could see her own longing reflected in his eyes. When their lips met, it was with the desperate tenderness of two people who had found something precious in the midst of a harsh world. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if they were both afraid this moment might shatter if handled too roughly. But as Livia's arms wound around his neck and Marcus pulled her closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of hunger, long denied, and hope, finally acknowledged. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This complicates everything," he said quietly. "I know. Your reputation, your standing in the community. I don't care. You should care." He pulled back slightly to look at her. "I'm still a marked man, Livia. Still a fugitive. Loving me could destroy everything you've worked to preserve. And not loving you could destroy everything that matters," she replied fiercely. They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other, both understanding that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Whatever happened now, whatever dangers they faced, they would face them together. "I should go," Marcus said eventually, though he made no move to release her. "You should," she agreed, but her arms tightened around him. "We need to be careful. If anyone suspected, I know, this can't be easy for you. A widow is expected to mourn properly." She silenced him with another kiss, shorter but no less intense than the first. "I mourned my husband properly," she said when they parted. "I loved him, and I grieved him, and I will always honor his memory. But I'm still alive, Marcus. I still have a heart capable of love. And whether that's proper or not, I can't change what I feel for you." His smile was radiant in the moonlight. "Then we face whatever comes together." "Together," she agreed. As they finally parted and returned to their separate quarters, both carried with them the memory of that moment in the garden. It would sustain them through the challenges ahead, a bright flame of hope in the gathering darkness. But neither could have anticipated just how soon that darkness would descend, or how severely their newfound love would be tested. 3 days later, the messenger arrived. The messenger wore the colors of the provincial magistrate, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. As he dismounted in their courtyard, Livia felt the bottom drop out of her world. Official messengers meant official business, and official business rarely brought good news to families like theirs. Marcus appeared from the olive grove at the sound of hoofbeats, took one look at the man's formal attire, and went very still. Gaius emerged from the house, his face already pale with apprehension. Only Helena continued her work, hanging laundry with steady hands, though Livia could see the tension in her shoulders. "Livia Claudia?" the messenger asked formally. "I am she." He unrolled a scroll sealed with red wax. "By order of Magistrate Quintus Cornelius Maximus, you are commanded to appear before the provincial court in Rome 3 days hence to answer charges of harboring a known fugitive." The words hit her like physical blows. Livia felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her. Someone had reported them. Someone had identified Marcus despite their precautions. What charges, specifically? Gaius asked, stepping forward with admirable composure. Harboring a deserter from the legions, concealing the whereabouts of condemned property of the state, fraud in the matter of false manumission papers. The messenger's voice was flat, disinterested. He had delivered hundreds of such summons and cared nothing for the devastation he left in his wake. Livia's knees nearly buckled. The false manumission papers, her lie to the neighbors, had somehow reached official ears. They not only knew Marcus was here, they knew she had lied about freeing him. Who brought these charges? Marcus asked, quietly. The messenger glanced at him with mild curiosity. You must be the gladiator in question. Marcus Aurelius, formerly of the 10th Legion, condemned to death by combat for desertion. He consulted his scroll again. The charges were brought by Centurion Lucius Maximus of the 4th Urban Cohort, the young officer who had visited weeks ago. Livia remembered the way he had stared at Marcus, the nagging familiarity in his expression. He had remembered where he had seen that face before, in the arena, fighting for his life, while Romans cheered for blood. The penalty for harboring fugitives is severe. The messenger continued with bureaucratic efficiency. For citizens of good standing, it typically means loss of property and exile. For the fugitive himself, he shrugged. Crucifixion, as originally sentenced. After the messenger left, they sat in the kitchen in stunned silence. The scroll lay open on the table between them, its formal language stark and unforgiving. 3 days. They had 3 days before Livia would be forced to stand before a Roman court and answer for her crime of compassion. You have to run, Gaius said finally, looking at Marcus. Tonight, get as far away as you can before they come for you. No. Marcus's voice was firm. Running would only make things worse for Livia. If I disappear now, they'll assume she helped me escape. The charges against her will be even more severe. So what do you suggest? Gaius's voice cracked with strain. That we all march to Rome and let them crucify you in the Forum. There might be another way, Livia said slowly, an idea beginning to form. The magistrate mentioned in the summons Quintus Cornelius Maximus. I know that name. How? Marcus asked. He's the cousin of Senator Marcus Cornelius, one of my late husband's business partners. They traded in olive oil and wine throughout the province. She looked up at them with the first spark of hope she had felt since the messenger arrived. He might remember my family name. He might be willing to listen. It's a slim chance, Helena said quietly. It's the only chance we have, Livia replied. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last night together, Livia found herself walking through the villa with new eyes. Every room held memories now. The kitchen where Marcus had slowly won over Helena with his gentle manners, the courtyard where he had faced down angry neighbors with quiet dignity, the olive grove where he had worked tirelessly to save their dying trees. She found him there as the sun was setting, standing among the pruned trees that were just beginning to show signs of recovery. The golden light caught the new growth, making it glow like tiny emeralds against the ancient bark. Thinking about what you're leaving behind? She asked softly. He turned to her with a sad smile. Thinking about what I never expected to find. She moved to stand beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. We could still run, she said quietly. All of us. Tonight. There are places beyond the Empire's reach. And leave this? He gestured at the trees, the carefully tended soil, the villa in the distance. This is your family's legacy, Livia. Your heritage. I won't be the reason you lose it. My heritage is just land and buildings, she replied fiercely. You're my heart. The simple declaration hung between them, more powerful than any elaborate declaration of love. Marcus turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. And you are mine, he said quietly, which is why I have to face this. I won't have you branded as a fugitive's accomplice. I won't have you running for the rest of your life because of choices I made. Then we face it together. Livia, together, she repeated firmly. We go to Rome, we stand before the magistrate, and we tell our story, the truth of it, all of it. The truth could get us both killed, and running could get us all killed. At least this way, we face our fate with honor. They held each other as the last light faded from the sky, both knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, this moment, this perfect, terrible moment, would have to sustain them through whatever came next. The journey to Rome took 2 days of hard travel. They were escorted by a small guard unit, led by the same centurion Maximus, who had identified Marcus. The young officer was polite but formal, treating them as prisoners, deserving of basic courtesy but nothing more. On the first night, as they made camp beside the road, Marcus finally spoke to his captor. "You remembered me from the arena," he said quietly. Centurion Maximus looked up from the fire he was tending. "Gladiator match about 6 months ago. You fought a Nubian with a trident. Good fight, you nearly died twice. Yet you waited weeks to report me." The young officer was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking I was mistaken. A gladiator working a farm seemed unlikely." He glanced at Livia, who sat beside Marcus with her chin raised defiantly. "Then I started asking questions, checking records. Your legal status was interesting. You discovered the false manumission papers." "There were no manumission papers, false or otherwise. The woman simply lied to protect you." His tone carried a note of grudging respect. "Foolish, but understandable. Will you testify to that at the hearing?" Livia asked. Centurion Maximus studied her for a long moment. "I'll testify to what I observed. Nothing more, nothing less." On the morning of the hearing, they were brought before Magistrate Quintus Cornelius Maximus in a marble-columned hall that spoke of Roman power and justice. The magistrate was a man in his 50s, grey-haired and stern-faced, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "Livia, Claudia," he said as she was brought forward. "I remember your family name. Your late husband was known to my cousin as an honest trader. Thank you, Your Honor. Which makes your current circumstances all the more puzzling." He consulted the scroll before him. "You are charged with harboring a fugitive, specifically this man." He gestured at Marcus, who stood in chains beside her. "Marcus Aurelius, condemned gladiator and deserter from the legions. How do you answer these charges?" Livia took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on her next words. "I answer that I purchased this man legally at public auction, Your Honor. I have the papers to prove it, yet you claim to have freed him when no such manumission took place. I lied to protect him from prejudice, Your Honor. Not from legal consequences, but from the hatred of neighbors who could not see past his former profession." "And why," the magistrate asked, "would you spend your family's last resources to purchase a condemned gladiator?" Here was the moment of truth. Livia could feel Marcus tense beside her, could sense the attention of everyone in the hall, focusing on her answer. She could lie, could claim it was mere charity or a business transaction. Or she could tell the truth and face the consequences. "Because I saw a man being sold like an animal, Your Honor. A man who deserved better than to be worked to death for the entertainment of crowds. Because sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing." A murmur ran through the hall. The magistrate's expression was unreadable. "And you, Marcus Aurelius," he said, turning his head to the chained gladiator. "You were legally condemned for desertion. Do you dispute this?" "No, Your Honor. I deserted my post." "Why?" Marcus straightened, meeting the magistrate's gaze without flinching. "Because I was ordered to commit atrocities against innocent civilians, Your Honor. Because I chose to preserve my honor rather than my life." "Honor?" The magistrate's voice was sharp. "You speak of honor after abandoning your sworn duty." "Yes, Your Honor. Sometimes the highest honor lies in refusing to follow orders that violate every principle of human decency. You realize that this admission confirms your guilt?" I do, and that the penalty remains death by crucifixion. Marcus nodded slowly. I understand the law, Your Honor. I also understand that some things are worth dying for. The magistrate was quiet for a long moment, studying both prisoners. Around them, the hall waited in tense silence. Centurion Maximus, the magistrate called finally. Present your evidence. The young officer stepped forward and gave his testimony with crisp military precision. He had identified the fugitive, confirmed the false claims about manumission, and observed the accused living openly on the defendant's farm. But when pressed for details about Marcus's behavior, his testimony took an unexpected turn. The accused showed no signs of violence or aggression, he reported. He appeared to be engaged in legitimate farm work. When questioned, he was respectful and cooperative. Did he attempt to flee when discovered? No, Your Honor. He remained to face the consequences of his presence. After the testimony concluded, the magistrate called for a recess to consider his judgment. Livia and Marcus were led to a small holding chamber to wait, still chained, but allowed to speak privately. Whatever happens, Marcus said quietly, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. Don't talk as if it's over, Livia replied fiercely. We don't know what he'll decide. I know Roman law. The penalty for desertion is death. The penalty for harboring fugitives is exile and loss of property. There's no room for sentiment in those judgments. Then we'll face them together. No, his voice was firm. If he offers you mercy in exchange for my surrender, you take it. You save yourself, your brother, Helena. You save the farm. I won't abandon you, and I won't let you throw your life away for mine. Before she could respond, they were summoned back to the hall. The magistrate had returned to his seat, his expression grave. The formal scroll lay open before him. Marcus Aurelius, he began, you stand convicted of desertion from the legions, a crime that carries the penalty of death by crucifixion. However, he paused, and Livia felt her heart stop. Testimony presented here suggests that your desertion was motivated by moral objection to illegal orders rather than cowardice or treason. Hope flickered in Livia's chest. Therefore, the magistrate continued, while I cannot overturn your conviction, I can commute your sentence. You will be returned to Gladiator school, where you will fight until you die or earn your freedom through victory. It was better than crucifixion, but not by much. Gladiators rarely survived more than a few years in the arena. The magistrate was essentially condemning Marcus to a slower, more entertaining death. Livia Claudia, the magistrate said, turning to her, you have admitted to harboring a fugitive and lying to authorities. Under normal circumstances, this would result in the confiscation of your property and permanent exile. Livia braced herself for the blow. However, he continued, your family's reputation for honesty, your financial losses resulting from this misguided compassion, and the testimony regarding your character lead me to impose a different sentence. He paused again, and Livia could feel the weight of the entire hall's attention. You will forfeit half your remaining property to the state as fine for your crimes. You will be prohibited from leaving the province for 5 years, and, his voice softened slightly, you will never again interfere with the lawful execution of imperial justice. It was a miracle, harsh, but survivable. She would lose much, but she would keep her life, her freedom and enough property to survive. But as relief flooded through her, she realized the terrible price of this mercy. She would live, and Marcus would die slowly in the arena. Your Honor, she called out as the guards moved to take Marcus away. I have a request. The magistrate raised an eyebrow. You are hardly in a position to make requests. Not a request for mercy, she said quickly. A request for justice. Livia's signs raced, searching for words that might save the man she loved. Your Honor has commuted my sentence in recognition of my family's reputation and my previous good character. I ask that you consider applying the same standard to Marcus Aurelius. Explain. Before his desertion, he served Rome faithfully for 8 years. He fought with honor in Germania, Gaul, and Britannia. His crime was a single moment of moral crisis, not a pattern of betrayal. She took a shaky breath, and since his escape, he has lived peacefully, harmed no one, and contributed to the welfare of Roman citizens through honest labor. You ask me to free him. I ask you to give him the same chance at redemption that you have given me. The hall erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers. The very idea that a magistrate might free a condemned gladiator was almost unthinkable. Marcus turned to stare at her in amazement. Livia, no. Don't risk your own mercy for your honor, she continued, her voice growing stronger. What serves Rome better? The death of a man who has proven he can contribute to society, or his life spent in service to Roman citizens? The magistrate studied her for a long moment, then looked at Marcus. And you, gladiator, what would you do with freedom if it were granted? Marcus straightened, meeting the older man's gaze. I would spend my life proving worthy of this woman's faith in me, your honor. I would work to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than kill, to serve rather than take. Pretty words. But you are a trained killer. What assurance do I have that you would not return to violence? You have the assurance that I have already chosen a different path. Your honor. When I could have fled, I stayed. When I could have fought my way free, I surrendered. When I could have lived by the sword, I chose to live by the plow. The magistrate was quiet for several long minutes. Around them the hall held its collective breath. It is an extraordinary request, he said finally, and one that goes against all precedent. Livia felt her heart begin to sink. However, he continued, these are extraordinary circumstances. A woman's willingness to sacrifice everything for a stranger's life. A gladiator's choice to face justice rather than flee. A soldier's moral stand against unconscionable orders. He stood, and everyone in the hall rose with him. Marcus Aurelius, he said formally, by the authority vested in me by the Senate and people of Rome, I hereby grant you conditional manumission. You will be bound to serve Livia Claudia for a period of 10 years as recompense for her loss. During this time, you will be subject to her authority and the oversight of this court. At the end of 10 years, if you have proven yourself worthy, you will be granted full citizenship and freedom. The hall erupted in chaos. Livia felt her knees buckle with relief and joy. Marcus stood frozen, as if unable to believe what he had heard. Furthermore, the magistrate continued, raising his voice over the din, should you violate the terms of this arrangement, should you flee or commit any crime, both you and Livia Claudia will face the full penalty of the law. Do you both understand and accept these terms? Yes, Your Honor. Livia managed to whisper, Yes, Your Honor. Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. As the chains were removed from Marcus's wrists and ankles, Livia found herself crying tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming gratitude. They had been given a miracle, a second chance that neither had dared to hope for. But even as she celebrated their unexpected salvation, she knew that the real challenge was just beginning. 10 years of servitude, 10 years of proving themselves worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. 10 years to build a life together under the watchful eye of Roman law. As they left the courthouse, Marcus took her hand for the first time as a free man bound to her by law, rather than chains. The touch was electric, charged with the promise of the future they would now have a chance to build together. 10 years, he said quietly as they walked toward the wagon that would take them home. 10 years, she agreed. Think we can manage it? Livia looked at him, this man who had faced death with dignity, who had chosen honor over safety, who had somehow found love in the midst of despair, and smiled. Ask me again in 11 years, she said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility.